So how have you been doing? I guess it's the afternoon for you. How are you doing today?
Good, good. I had a couple of productive meetings today, and yeah, the day is almost over here in Berlin, or the work day is. So yeah, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. It's quite early today. It's at 10 o'clock. So I just had my morning class and then came to set up for this interview.
Nice.
So for the people who will watch this video, this is Jacey Bingler, who is the Director of Communications at Ecosia, which is a web search engine that plants trees with 80% of its profits. Um, so thank you very much for agreeing to help create this Aim to Flourish case study. So just to get started, can we start with a quick overview from you of what Ecosia is, how it works, uh, before we dive more deeply into the specifics of the matter?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you already introduced Ecosia pretty well. I couldn't have said it any better. It's a search engine that basically works like any other search engine, meaning you can look for whatever you like. And just like with any other search engine, you will see ads next to the regular search results. And as soon as a user clicks on one of those ads, we make revenue, which we then use to cover our running costs like office rent and salaries, marketing and travel expenses, etc. And we then use our profits to plant trees. And so far, we've been able to finance the planting of 15 or already more than 15 million trees in about 12 different countries, which is really exciting because when I started working with Ecosia about 2.5 years ago, I remember it would take us about half a year or maybe 8 or 9 months to reach the next million tree milestone. I think I started when we'd just planted 2 million trees, and 8 months later it was 3 million. And now we've reached a new million every 2 or 3 weeks, which is really awesome. So that's thanks to our users, which are based all over the world, many of them in the US, Canada, many of them in Europe, for example, Germany and France and Spain and the UK. And yeah, our big goal is to plant 1 billion trees by 2020, which is a very ambitious goal. And we're not quite sure yet if we're going to reach it. But if more people come across Ecosia and start using it as their search engine, maybe we will.
The one moment, sorry, weird thing just happened. Okay, sorry about that.
No
Um,
problem.
you said that you're planting trees in Canada and the UK?
Oh no, our users are based in the US and Canada and the UK and many European countries like Germany and Austria and Switzerland and France, but also Australia and New Zealand. We plant trees um, in hotspots, in biodiversity hotspots, which means that the trees that are being planted in countries in those areas, for example, the west coast of the US is considered a biodiversity hotspot, meaning that if you plant trees in one of those areas, they will have the biggest positive impact on the ecosystem, on the local flora and fauna, etc. And so we try to plant trees in those areas, and we also try to plant trees in areas where the local communities wouldn't be able to afford tree planting programs without help from, well, basically us, for example, meaning that we try to help those who need to be supported, so we can empower communities to, at some stage, be able to support themselves. So that's how we usually try to choose where to plant trees.
Yes, and I assume that similarly the cost of operating in a developing country is also lower than it would be to conduct the same operations in a developed country. So you can plant more trees for every euro you invest in the global south, as opposed to if you're conducting your tree planting in the global north.
And planting trees or paying people to plant trees in countries like Madagascar and Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Indonesia, etc., usually also means that you can really support whole villages, and that you can give people a dependable source of income. They can harvest forest goods that grow often already after a couple of months, because we don't replant trees, but we also pay for the planting of crops, of herbs and vegetable and fruit plants, or nut-bearing trees, for example. And the local farmers can harvest the forest goods and either use them for their own consumption or to sell them on the local markets. Which means that they have a dependable source of income. It improves their nutrition and their health. It helps stabilize the local economic and political and social situation, just because people are not as dependent on the governments or on the outside world, because slowly but surely they can live off healthy forests instead of cutting them down and then not having anything to live on anymore. And it also helps to allow them to get access to a global market, for example, by selling forest goods that are highly valued in cosmetics, for example. Like there are a couple, like shea butter, or coconut oil, etc., or certain health foods like moringa and baobab, which is something that is being harvested in our planting sites in Burkina Faso, for example. Being able to harvest and then sell those goods allows people to kind of create a better future for themselves. And that's something that is very important to us, which is why, it looks like the trees that we plant in those countries have a bigger impact than the trees being planted in I don't know, in areas where, for example, the local governments would be able to pay for them, but they just prioritize other things, or where local communities could plant them themselves because they could afford to do so.
So since we're talking about Ecosia, but we're also talking about individuals, and since you're the person we have the delight of interviewing, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what brought you to the company Ecosia.
I about 2.5 years ago, I was already working in marketing and communications in the broader sense. And although I enjoyed what I was doing in general, I was lacking inspiration and being able to work on something more meaningful. I was very close to leaving the industry entirely, just because I didn't want to be in tech anymore. I didn't really want to do marketing and PR anymore, or search engine optimization, etc. Just because I felt like I wanted to do something more useful with my time, and I wanted to use what I hope I'm kind of good at. I wanted to use that for something I could actually believe in. And so I thought, well, either I just find something entirely different, or I try to use my talents for a company that works on something that I actually believe in. And then luckily I came across Ecosia and applied for a job and got the job. And that's how I joined the team about 2.5 years ago.
So can you tell us about a high point in your life and or career?
Yeah, absolutely. Earlier this year in May, I was lucky enough to be allowed to join Ecosia on a trip to one of our planting sites in Indonesia, and that was incredible. It was incredibly humbling and a very exciting and very inspiring experience. Just because, for example, it took us 8 hours to travel from a small village, or the smallest village with an airport, to one of our planting sites, and that was about 25 miles. So it was really, I mean, unless if you have to travel through I don't know, high traffic in as a commuter in a very busy city like Los Angeles or New York or something, you're really not used to taking this much time to travel or to cover such a small distance. And there's nothing. I mean, there are no hospitals. There are no schools. There are no political institutions really, meaning that the people living close to the planting sites, if anything happens to anyone there, they have to travel for 8 hours to get to a hospital, for example. The kids have to travel or move to a different place if they want to attend school and get higher education. And there's no electricity, no running water, obviously no internet connection. But to go to these rather remote places and meet the people who plant the trees that the Ecosia users help pay for, that was incredible, because the people working there and the people living on the planting sites and next to the planting sites were just unbelievably friendly, incredibly bright, and very clever and motivated, and just really, really excited to meet us, and very interested in what we're doing, and eager to tell us that they're very, very grateful for this program, and that they find it exciting that people on the other side of the planet use a search engine, which then generates funds that helps pay for the tree planting they engage with. And that was really, really interesting. And it helped me realize that even if we should never be able to reach our goal of planting 1 billion trees by 2020, the 15 million trees we've planted so far have already had a huge impact on a couple of people, and on a couple of areas where now landscapes are being restored, and endangered species like orangutans, for example, which you only find in Indonesia on Borneo, which is the island where our planting programs are located.
There are 2 kinds of orangutans, right? There's the Borneo subspecies and the Java subspecies.
I think so, yeah. And apart from on these 2 islands, they're not endemic to any other spot on the planet. And that's the fact that so much of the rainforest is being cut down in Indonesia to make more space for palm oil monocultures is devastating. And that was also something that was really scary to see, that you can fly over really what seems never-ending palm oil fields where nothing else grows, because palm oil trees or palm trees are not a native species, meaning you need a lot of pesticides and fertilizers to keep them growing, which means that nothing else survives there. If you walk through a palm oil plantation, which is not really something you should be doing because it's really very poisonous, you don't hear any birds, there are no bugs, there are no other animals, nothing survives, and the soil as well as the water are poisoned and just really damaged for a long time, for decades after the plantations have already been cut down, because after a while the soil is just completely exhausted and nothing grows anymore.
So one thing I also understand about palm oil well, 2 things I suppose. One is that in order to clear the land, the forest is burned, which also burns the peat below the forest. So if you go to places like Jakarta, capital of Indonesia, it looks like it's covered in fog, but it's actually the smoke from burning forests. And that periodically a palm oil plantation has to be cut down and burnt again and then replanted. And I also just happen to know that perhaps most of the people who work on palm oil plantations are slaves and are working there against their will. So it's certainly not creating jobs unless you consider slavery to be employment.
Yeah, and in many cases, people, even if they sell their land voluntarily, often it's because they think, or they often don't have another choice, because they're being told that if they're being threatened, or they're being tricked into believing that this will give them a fortune, and they're being bribed with houses in the cities, or with what sounds like a big sum of money, but will then after a few years will be gone. And since they then sold their land, they don't have any source of income anymore. So it's a very, very frightening situation, and it's really terrible for the people in the area.
And there are two kinds of chimpanzees. Just looked it up. I should have used Ecosia. I realize I actually whoops. But there are two subspecies, or two different species that live on Java, yes, and also, or no, Sumatra and Borneo. So just so our viewers know where the orangutans are.
Yeah, and actually part of our reforestation program in Indonesia, in Borneo, is orangutan rehabilitation. So on the one hand, we're trying to build corridors between the last remaining patches of primary rainforests, which are usually found in mountains, because it's too difficult to make or to build plantations on the slopes of the mountains, because it rains a lot. The soil is not very it tends to just slide off the mountain, and it's harder to deforest these areas. But slowly but surely these spots of primary rainforest keep shrinking, which also diminishes the habitat of the last remaining orangutans that are to be found in the wild. So what we're trying to do is connect these remaining spots of primary forest and build corridors between these patches of forest, so orangutans can migrate again and have more space to spread and to mate, basically, and to help stabilize the population on Borneo. And there are also rehabilitation centers where doctors work, where they take care of orphaned orangutans or injured animals, and then after training them, or just trying to help them recover for many months, they re-release them into the wild, into those patches of protected forest. And it's really, it was also cool to see one of those, or two of those rehabilitation centers. Actually, we saw the one that was closer to the small city that I mentioned, which is one of the last places you can fly into from Jakarta, for example, or actually another slightly smaller place. And then one forest school, so to say, in the mountains, where the orangutans that are almost ready to be re-released into the wild spend another couple of months before they're then really released, and not really taken care of anymore on a daily basis by the doctors and people taking care of the orangutans.
So are those rehabilitation centers also being supported by searches on Ecosia?
In part, I mean, it's a different organization that is affiliated with the organization that we support, but in part the searches supports the rehabilitation of the orangutans. But the most important work is actually the rebuilding of the reforestation of what used to be and will hopefully again be the habitat of the orangutans.
But I guess that means that besides the 15 million trees planted that you advertise, there are also a number of other things that are being supported in addition that the casual user of Ecosia isn't immediately aware of. Like rehabilitation.
Exactly, or the jobs that are being created, the hectares of land that are being restored, and the fact that tree planting can also help restart water cycles. For example, in Burkina Faso or Madagascar, where the climate is very different to Indonesia, where years of deforestation and years without rain caused serious droughts, which means that the land is basically it's like concrete. So the soil is so arid and so solid that you really need strong machinery to be able to plow through it. But that's what we're doing in one of our projects in Burkina Faso, where we actually shortly before the rainy season, so there still is something like a rainy season. Shortly before the rainy season, we use tractors to plow half-moon shaped holes in the ground into which seeds are just directly being thrown or placed, because once it rains, these basins store water, meaning it doesn't just flow away. If you imagine a lot of water, because if it rains in Burkina Faso, it rains a lot. It rains a lot for a while, and then it stops, and then there's no rain for another 9 or 10 months. And since the soil is so compressed and hard, the water just floods and just rushes away. But thanks to these basins, each seed has some kind of a water reservoir, which is enough to get it through the dry season, and which allows it to start growing and build roots. And the taller the trees grow, the more the roots develop, and the further down they reach. And at some stage, they reach the what do you call it, groundwater, or the subsurface water. Groundwater, yeah.
Accurate.
And as soon as that happens, and as soon as there's some kind of a leaf or forest cover, condensation will cause clouds to build some kind of a cloud structure above the forest, which then causes more condensation and rainfall. So trees really start or restart water cycles in areas where years of deforestation have basically turned the land into a desert. So that's an effect we're trying to support in Burkina Faso, or for example in Madagascar, where it's really becomes so dry that nothing would survive if you just try to plant it, because there's no water and just too much heat.
Okay. So assuming you were to plant 1 billion trees the way you hope to by 2020, do you know how much of the overall global deforestation that's happened so far that would repair?
It's not even close to enough, actually. If I remember
more
correctly.
people need to get searching then.
So if I remember correctly, I mean there are different sources, but according to one source I looked into with our tree planting officer, he's the one with the scientific background at Ecosia. I think 15 billion trees are being cut down every year, but only 6 billion are being reforested, which leaves us with a negative 9 billion trees every year. So the 1 billion trees we hope to be able to contribute by 2020 are not going to be enough. And according to other sources, it's even 15 billion trees negative that we end up with every year. So I think the 1 billion trees would be an awesome achievement, a good starting point. But then that's probably where the real hard work would begin, and where we would have to look into, okay, how do we really take this to the next level and try to stop deforestation, or really mitigate the effects of global deforestation.
Thank you. Maybe it's the goal you just reached of 15 million trees, but can you elaborate on a high point, since we heard a high point for you, a high point for the company?
I think what was really incredible and just a very strange situation to be in was when we grew really significantly earlier this year. At some stage, we had more financial support at our disposal than we had tree planting organizations in our portfolio that would have been able to to use the financial support, because some of them are still at a level where they can plant a certain amount of trees, even a couple of million, but the amount of money we would have been able to give them to scale their projects, they just wouldn't have been able to do it as fast as we would have been able to support them. So at the moment, we're still in the luxurious situation where we're trying to find even more tree planting partners and more organizations that meet our very, very strict criteria, because we have very high standards when it comes to how are the local communities involved in the planting, and how sustainable are the planting approaches, and do the environment as well as the local species and flora and fauna in general, do they benefit from the programs? So we're still looking for more organizations, because we still have more tree planting funds that we could distribute than we have organizations that can absorb the support we have. So that's when we realized that we'd made it to this point, that was something that told us that maybe we could really make this something that could have a huge impact. So that was really cool earlier this year, and we're still in this situation where we realized that this could become something really big, and it's already gotten something pretty big.
That is great. Maybe you'll blow right through that goal of 1 billion trees.
Hopefully that would be really cool, but yeah, we'll see.
So when you look at Ecosia as it exists today, how much of it is the same as it was when it was founded in 2009, right?
Mm-hmm. December 2009, yeah.
It was founded in 2009, and how much of it is new aspects that have been contributed by other people who've come on over the years and taken it in new directions, or taken on new initiatives?
I mean, the core idea never really changed. This really brilliant idea Christian, our founder, had many years ago. I mean, almost 10 years ago. Until then, in 2009, he actually managed to start working on this, and he founded Ecosia. But the core idea of trying to find a way of using the profits generated by search engine to plant as many trees as possible, that's still what Ecosia is all about. Without that, Ecosia wouldn't exist, and that's still what is the main driver of our business. But the way Ecosia looks now, the fact that it's become a really cool tool that is that can kind of compete with the giants of the search industry, and that has already been able to that has already empowered so many people to plant so many trees and to support so many cool projects. That's thanks to the team that has been working on it. And that happened in the past couple of years, when, thanks to the growth, we saw we were able to hire more really cool people who could help us with product design and business development and accounting and tree planting. I mean, the fact that we now have a tree planting officer who really knows what to look for and how to evaluate the projects that we have, or people who can join us to the planting sites and film the tree planting and conduct interviews with the local population, our tree planting partners. That's something that was added to Ecosia in the past couple of years, and without that, Ecosia also wouldn't be what it is today. So it's really a mix. The idea is still the same, and it never really changed, but it grew, and the fact that it's so big and we've been able to plant so many trees by now, that wouldn't have been possible if it would have only been Christian. So yeah, it really was a team effort.
So I know you just mentioned it was exciting to hire a tree planting officer who knows all about that. What sort of credentials does a company look for when they're hiring that slightly unusual position?
Well, anyone with either experience or maybe a degree in landscape restoration, or biodiversity, biology, sociology. Peter, for example, used to work in the CO2 standard, or the CO2 neutralization and offsetting industry, but he also has a background in landscape restoration, and he knows the reforestation world, or the industry, quite well. But yeah, that's kind of what we were looking for, and then we came across Peter, and he's actually probably going to look for support, or for someone to help him with that in the future. So we might need more help when it comes to that.
Oh, great! I'll let the biologists I know
know
about that opportunity. That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
This is just a kind of random question that only just occurred to me now. But you say you have more money than you can put into tree planting initiatives. Has anybody ever floated the idea of replanting a kelp forest, for example? or restoring some biodiversity underwater?
That's something I've come across, that kind of idea on Facebook a couple of times, when people, when we post videos, they say, yeah, tree planting is really cool, but did you know that most of the CO2 is being neutralized or captured underwater? So yeah, that could actually be pretty cool, but it's something we haven't really looked into yet. So if you know anyone, or if you know any projects, please send us a link. It could be really interesting to look into that. But until, yeah.
I know in the Hawaiian Islands, they're trying very hard to keep their the Great Barrier, or not to keep their reefs alive, but their reefs they believe they're now in irreversible decline. Yeah. And in Australia, the Great Barrier Reef is believed to also be in irreversible decline now. So I confess I do not know how to restore a reef, but there's probably somebody out there who does.
Hopefully, yeah.
So I know you mentioned you have had tree planting operations in Madagascar and in Indonesia, but I think over the years you've planted in something like 16 or 20 different countries. Could you, to the extent that you think is expedient, I don't mean to force you to talk about for 2 hours about every single detail project you've done, but tell us a little bit about each of the different locales where you've planted trees over the past 8 years.
Mm-hmm. So we started out in Brazil, which is where we now also started supporting a new project. So it's nice that we now were able to kind of return to our roots, so to speak, or to the very beginning, to the start. I don't know if you know Sebastian Salgado, who's he's an awesome photographer. He became most famous for his war photography, and for his photography he went to areas where people were suffering from poverty and famine, for example. And he's from Brazil, and he decided to reforest an area in which I think a farm his family used to own was located in. And since the area was heavily deforested, mainly because of cattle farming, he decided to reforest the area. So his is a project we're supporting together with a couple of other projects, mainly along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean. Then we started supporting a project in Peru 2 years ago, and there the fact that drug trafficking and drug plantations or cocaine plantations cause a lot of issues for the local population. The fact that there are other crops that could maybe help people have a dependable source of income without being involved in drug trafficking. For example, by looking into sustainable coffee and cacao, meaning cocoa farming. That's something we're trying to focus on, and it's already had quite a big impact on the area. Another project that is going to be added to the portfolio, or we kind of already started supporting it, is in Nicaragua, as well as Ecuador. And there, obviously, those are areas where a lot of coffee plantations have kind of degenerated the area, but there are ways of planting coffee and cocoa in a more sustainable way, while at the same time trying to restore the landscape, because the deforestation of the very mountainous areas changes the way water runs off the mountain slopes, flooding villages regularly, because there are just no woods and no individual trees to stop the water from running down the mountain slopes. So in those areas, in those mountainous areas in South American countries, our trees are usually helping to restore the landscape, and as well as helping people have an independent source of income. Then I mentioned Madagascar already. There's Morocco, which is also very interesting projects, because there are a couple of nurseries that are run by juvenile delinquents, so to speak. Or there's one. It's a bit like an orphanage, or a mix between an orphanage and a boarding school, where mainly young boys, but children who ended up on the streets or were kind of kicked out by their families, where they live, where they get food and education, but where they're also being trained to become professional tree planters and farmers. And there they run nurseries and learn how to plant trees as sustainably as possible, and to really make a living out of it. So that's something that's really interesting. As well as there's one nursery led entirely by women, and in Morocco, women don't always enjoy the best standing, or they're not necessarily well. For example, a couple of years ago when we visited the planting site this year, the woman who led us through the nursery and introduced us to the women working there, and who we then took a picture of, or asked if they would allow us to take a picture of them. The woman who introduced us to them said that a couple of years ago they wouldn't have felt confident enough to have their picture taken, but the fact that they now they have a job and learn new skills and realize that they're very good at what they're doing, and that it's gonna probably change their future. That has made them more confident, and that's just, it's pretty cool to see. Then there's a new project, or it's a project that we just started supporting recently with the Jane Goodall Institute in Uganda, where chimpanzees, just like, or similar to the situation in Borneo, where the remaining patches of primary forest are shrinking rapidly, which means that we again are trying to build corridors between the remaining patches of forest so that chimpanzees have a bigger habitat, and where we are trying to support Jane Goodall's efforts to restore the area and protect chimpanzees. There's an amazing project in Tanzania where two brothers who used to work in ecotourism decided that they, instead of only introducing tourists to the beauty of their home, the Uzambara Mountains, they wanted to do more and try to restore the area, because the area had in large parts been degenerated by forests having been cut down and burnt. So they organized a tree planting program, basically just the two of them, but they were in touch with many different institutions, with the government, with tourism agencies, with local schools. So now they actually have one of the biggest planting programs in our portfolio, meaning they can plant many million trees a year just because they manage to mobilize everyone, and they make tree planting a part of the curriculum in the local schools, meaning that for example, every Friday for 2 or 3 hours, the kids will go to a local nursery and plant trees themselves, and will learn about the necessity and the importance of tree planting, so that future generations will continue doing this. And that's something that I find really incredible. And there's a new project in Ethiopia, which our tree planting officer and one of my colleagues from the communications team are going to travel to this week. So I hope they're going to come back with really interesting footage. And yeah, what more projects are there? It's so many of them that I haven't even. I mean, since we haven't visited all of them yet, I haven't seen all of the footage yet. So I'm still waiting for some stories from the planting sites. But I think that's basically that's probably a pretty good overview of the different projects we support at the moment.
How did did Mr. Kroll and the early Ecosia team decide that once they decided they wanted to start a business that was going to do good, how did they decide to go with a search engine?
Well, Christian studied business administration, and I think pretty early on he knew that he wasn't interested in a traditional corporate business model, but he was always very interested in the online industry, especially search, and he knew that a lot of money was to be made in search, or with a search engine. I think the revenue expected to be made in online advertising in 2020 is 263 billion or something, which is it's incredible. I mean, just imagine what could be done with this kind of money. And I think search engines like Google make I think Google makes $70 billion dollars or $70 billion is the amount of revenue that circulates in the search industry every year. And I think in 2014, Google made about 14 billion in profits, but I'm not exactly sure. I would have to look into the number again. But Christian knew that there was definitely a lot of money to be made with search, and that this kind of money could be used for something more meaningful rather than to be kept in boardrooms or invested in stock, or just rather than he wanted to distribute the money and give it back to people, and kind of tried to work on making the disbalance a bit less unfair and creating more of a balance, rather than just make a couple of people insanely rich.
About how many euros do you have to spend per tree you plant?
At the moment, we pay about 22 cents per tree on average, because that's if you look at the different projects, in a couple of areas, planting one tree and then also taking care of it, meaning watering it or planting it from a nursery into the ground, etc., and with all the aftercare. In some areas, or in some of our projects, a tree or planting one tree will cost $1.50 or something, or $2. Whereas in other projects, where, for example, in Madagascar, where with mangroves, you have these seed propagules which you can just throw into the marshy ground like darts, playing darts. And you don't really have to do anything with them after that, because they will start growing and develop roots, which really keeps the price down, because the local people just walk around and just throw the seed propagules into the ground, meaning that we pay 10 cents per planted tree in Madagascar. So on average, we pay about 22 cents per tree, distributed all over the portfolio that we have.
And when deciding what goal to take on with the money that was raised from the search engine, how did they decide that it was tree planting that they were going to go with?
Well, by planting trees, you can tackle many issues or address many issues at the same time. Meaning you can increase people's livelihoods by helping them grow more healthy foods and have a bigger variety of food, thanks to the forest goods that they can plant and harvest after a couple of months already. Like I explained earlier, you can help restart water cycles and restore landscapes. You can protect endangered species and neutralize CO2 emissions. So there are many different things you can achieve simply by planting trees, which is what made tree planting, which is a very tangible, or tree planting has a very tangible outcome, and it's kind of easy, so to speak, to measure the progress of tree planting, and that made it very appealing to Christian. And so he decided that, especially after having read about how planting a large number of trees could really help mitigate the effects of climate change. That's how he decided to go for tree planting.
What do you think made you somebody who was committed to doing this to working at a company like Ecosia? You said you were frustrated with the tech industry and ready to leave, but then you found a tech industry that was better than the others. But evidently some people do keep working in the tech industry, even in companies that don't plant trees. So what do you think, was essential in the creation of your identity as somebody who wanted to work at a company like Ecosia instead of somewhere like maybe Microsoft or IBM?
I mean, there are some amazing jobs at Microsoft and IBM, and some positions that are probably really, really interesting. I think I would be. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't be averse to working in a different company. But what makes me really enjoy this job at Ecosia, and what makes me really believe in it, is the fact that I feel like what I'm doing is really having an impact and helping other people do something incredibly special. I mean, we're not the ones getting our hands dirty on a day-to-day basis. That's something that I find very important to remember, that we're not the ones planting trees. We're not the ones digging holes when it's, I don't know, 120 degrees Fahrenheit or something. But what we can do is try to reach out to a global community of people who would maybe be willing to switch a product they're using, or who would be willing to use a different service to support the people who do plant the trees and who do depend on that kind of support. And just the fact that there's so much to learn, when it comes to the tech side of things, but also to the tree planting side of things. And that there are so many interesting stories to tell, whether it's top level things like this is how trees restore landscapes or restart water cycles, down to individual stories of the people we meet in the planting programs. There's just so much to discover and to then share with the outside world, that I feel like it never really ends. So that even after 2.5 years of working for Ecosia, I still discover new things and feel like I don't know enough about all the different things we're working on, just because there's so much to know about it, and to be able to share this kind of knowledge with people and maybe help them get as excited about it as I am. That's something that I find really, really appealing. And I think that there are very cool jobs out there that, just like you said, don't help other people plant trees, and that don't really have anything to do with social businesses in general. But yeah, I just like the fact that what I'm working on could maybe have a scalable effect, and that's something that really motivates me.
When you're at your most optimistic, how do you think the world could be better in 10 years than it is now?
Oh, I don't. Sometimes I wish I could be more optimistic when it came to that. I mean, I hope that more people would realize that there are so many different business models, or so many different businesses or products that could have a similar effect to what Ecosia is having, or to what many of the B corporations are already having. Meaning, I don't know, looking into a more transparent supply chain, or fair pay for their workers wherever they're based, or looking into more sustainable resources, or I don't know, electricity even, up to the point where people would maybe say, yeah, this is the amount of profits that I have every month, and I would be willing and able to part with some of it to support a good cause. So yeah, I would on the one hand hope that more businesses would decide to do something like what we're doing, and I would maybe also hope that people would start to think more globally rather than just focus on smaller and smaller circles of people. So the opposite effect of I don't know, nationalism, for example, realizing that everyone's actions and inactions and way of consuming and doing business has an effect, even if it doesn't necessarily look like it from one's point of view. So what I buy, what I vote for, the way I travel, what I say about other people has an effect, even if I can't see the consequences immediately. And I would hope that people would maybe become a bit more mindful and live a bit more compassionately in the next 10 years.
Okay, thank you. One last technical question. When the company interviewed for an Aim to Flourish has a promotional video that they've circulated, as Ecosia does, we often will include that in the case study next to the interview. So I just wanted to make sure we had your permission to include, for example, the video that is in your Facebook promotions would be a good one, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. Feel free to use it, and let me know if that works, or if you need anything else. But yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it. It was a delight. And I wish you the greatest possible success.
Thank you. It was so nice of you to take the time to talk to me and ask so many questions. And it's really great that you were interested in Ecosia. And I really appreciate it.
Okay, well, I guess it's the end of the day for you, so I'll let you go home and have a safe commute.
Thank you. Have a nice day, and fingers crossed for all your projects and everything.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.